So when we get to the United States, remember that we have now jumped. We last left off at 1763. The United States wasn't a country; it was a set of colonies that were owned by the British. Now we have fast forwarded past the Revolutionary War, and the United States is now their own independent country. They've actually have had one set of government called the Articles of Confederation that was from 1781 to 1787, and then they actually established a new form of government that's under the Constitution, which we still have today. That Constitution was ratified in 1789. So, to give you some context, the United States has become an independent country, independent from Great Britain through the Revolutionary War, and it has gone through a couple versions of how to set up their government. So when we're talking about the migration and settlement of the United States, two ways that the United States dealt with migration and settlement early on during the Articles of Confederation was the Land Ordinance of 1785 and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And so the Land Ordinance of 1785, it deals with all this territory here, in what would become like the Midwest of the United States, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. And what they want to do is they know people want to move out there. But how do we make sure, this is what the United States is asking right now, how do we make sure that or how can we set up, right, the even distribution of land or the selling of land out there in these territories to people? And the Land Ordinance of 1785, all it did is it came up with a consistent and organized way to survey and sell the land in what's called the Northwest Territory. And they did this through a variety of grids. So you can see, like, they just surveyed or mapped out the land into these little grids, right? Of equal square miles, and then you were able to buy plots of land within those grids. And each grid was, or each set had a certain township or a certain, square that was set aside for public education. So, how did the United States first start to deal with the migration and settlement into the Northwest Territory? Well, first, with the Land Ordinance of 1785, they set up a system for the selling of land. And then, what do we do with with these territories once people have come up there? That's the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787 essentially establishes requirements that territories have to meet before they can apply to become states in the in as part of our country. And so once a territory had like 60,000 people, they could then draft up a constitution and they could apply to become a state, right? In the United States of America. So the Northwest Ordinance, once again, dealt with how to organize the migration and settlement of these new territories. One other thing here is the migration that affected the migration and settlement of the United States. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803. The United States purchases this big bulk of land from the French in 1803. It doubles the size of the United States. And so what the president at that time, Thomas Jefferson, does is he sends out two men to say, hey, what did we buy? Let's find out what we bought. And so Lewis and Clark go on this expedition, they essentially find out what the Louisiana Territory has to offer in terms of resources, who is already out there in terms of the Native Americans, right? And what potential does it have for the United States for future migration and settlement. As a result of the Lewis and Clark expedition, they also established a trail, an overland trail to the Pacific Ocean. It becomes known as the Oregon Trail. All right. Other things here that we want to look at, the market revolution. All right, so we're looking at, like, the early 1800s. Industrialization comes to the United States, right? So we start to see the United States, start to develop factories, and they start to then, really start to use things like steamboats and canals and railroads. And so, what does this do to migration and settlement? Well, not only do factories give you a chance to make more goods, right, more efficiently, you can mass produce goods, but all these new forms of transportation and communication, like canals and steamboats and steam engines, it allows people from different parts of the country, all right, to communicate with each other and to trade with each other. So now people are more willing to, or they're able to migrate and settle right out there in the Midwest, out there in these new territories, and they are still have the ability to sell their goods back east or to have access to those goods that are made in the factories back east. So what this does here is you start to see, as a result of the market revolution, as a result of industrialization, you start to see these different regions, right, or these different spots of the United States become interdependent. They can rely on each other. They can work with each other instead of being these independent entities. So you'll start to see during the market revolution this huge flux of people migrating and moving out west. And partly is because there's opportunity out there, and then there's other, there's not that fear that you're going to be isolated anymore. The impact of this market revolution is you start to see some sectional differences in economics between the North and the South. The North, mostly with factories, heavier populated. So you see those cities and those urban areas in the North, and so there's a denser amount of settlement in the North, and in the South, more rural. And so farmland spread out, less dense as far as people settling there, so more room for yourselves. And because it's based on farming, you still see that dependence and that reliance on enslaved Africans, right, or enslaved people. So you see the rise and the continued presence of slavery there in the South. One more thing, as far as an impact of the Industrial Revolution in the United States, is you start to see in the 1830s and 40s, you start to see the first wave of immigrants really coming into the United States. You see the Irish immigrants; they're migrating, voluntarily migrating to the United States in the 1830s and 40s, mostly as a result of like economic opportunity and a way to improve their lives. There's a famine going on in Ireland at this time where there's a lack of food. And so you see Irish coming in huge swaths, right? And mostly staying in like along the seacoast in the cities like New York. For jobs. The Germans are coming as well, as a result of this increased economic opportunity. But the Germans are a little bit better off than the Irish, and so you see the Germans start to migrate and settle farther west, and they develop or set up in areas like Wisconsin and Minnesota, really in the middle of what we call the United States today. So that's another example of voluntary migration and settlement, and why we started to see the Irish and the Germans start to migrate and settle in the United States during that time period. As a result of the United States expanding, and as a result of the United States starting to see the benefits of expanding their territory and migrating and settle in territories farther and farther out west, you see this idea of manifest destiny come about. And manifest destiny is just this idea that Americans have the right, they are destined to expand from Atlantic Ocean to Pacific Ocean, that God has set out for the United States of America, right? The opportunities and the opportunities for them to expand, to settle, and to conquer these new territories. And so Manifest Destiny in the 1840s becomes this idea that God wants, right? And God has destined the United States to expand and to migrate and to settle farther and farther out west. The effects of this idea of manifest destiny, that Americans have this God-given right to expand, is a couple of things here. Number one, we get what's called the Oregon Territory up here, and we start to see Americans migrate and settle up here in the northwestern part of the United States. And then the second thing that we see happen as a result of Manifest Destiny is we come into conflict with Mexico. Mexico owns this land here, all right? Present day California, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, Utah. And as a result of Manifest Destiny, as a result of Americans pushing into places like Texas, and the southwest corner and pushing into Mexican territory, we see the Mexican War break out. And as a result of the Mexican American War, the United States gets all this land here in this corner of the map. So we get California, we get Nevada, we get Arizona, we get New Mexico, we get Utah. So these territories that will become known as those states, we get, and we're able to migrate and settle into those states as a result of the Mexican-American War that happened in 1846 and 1848. All right, so we talked a lot about voluntary migration. One of the things that we did not talk about yet is involuntary migration. And involuntary migration and settlement really affects two major groups, the Native Americans and Africans. And so we see with the Native Americans, the United States carries on that tradition that was established by the British of like having these separate spheres, right? So we live here and the Native Americans live here. And one thing that we see, some cases that we see of like the Native Americans being pushed farther and farther outside of their original land and inhabitants first started in what's called the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. So the Treaty of Greenville is this, right? And it's basically saying that the United States is making an agreement with the Native Americans. If you give us this territory right here, right, that's in purple, then you can have the rest of this territory to the west and we won't mess with you, all right? Well, that's great until we get the Louisiana Purchase, and now all of a sudden we have more territory. So the Native Americans, like they have a history of the United States of being forced to migrate and move farther and farther west. It starts with the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. That's the first line. Then when we get all this new territory here in 1803, we come into conflict with them again, right? And then as we start to expand into areas in like places like Georgia and the southeast, like Alabama and Mississippi, we come into conflict with them again. So every time the United States comes into conflict with Native Americans, and usually it's in conflict because we want the land that the Native Americans are on, because of the resources that are on that land. What happens most of the time is the Native Americans are forced to move off that land and they are forced to move farther and farther west. It happens with the Treaty of Greenville. We see with Louisiana Purchase, we see all those instances of conflict and disputes over the land, and we see the forceful the forced removal of Native Americans from places like Georgia, North Carolina, Alabama, and Mississippi in the 1830s, which was what's known as the Indian Removal Act, which this is a law that was created by the United States that said that the Native Americans have to be moved from these territories or from these areas and moved farther west, essentially so farmers, right, white farmers in the South can gain access to their land. The other group that's really impacted by involuntary migration are the Africans. And I would really encourage you to spend some time looking at these links here, and just spending some time looking at the maps of the African slave trade, the makeup of a slave ship, some more timeline statistics, and then this, right? This here is a really powerful video that shows you the increase, right? And this is sheer amount of forced migration of Africans, right, as they were kidnapped and enslaved and forced to migrate from West Africa across the Atlantic Ocean, known as the Middle Passage, and into the Americas to serve as enslaved people on the Caribbean sugarcane fields or on the southern plantations. So in your notes, I've asked you to spend some time with these links. This is not the last time that we're going to look at the history of African slavery, but I wanted to use these links and use these sites as an introduction to them and get you to have an idea, right, and start forming opinions of what involuntary migration of Africans look like, why it happened, and the impacts that it had on that people, right? So make sure that you're looking at these notes and come into class with any questions that I can help you out with.